The front door slammed so hard the glass trembled, and my grandson stood there with rain on his lashes and the word intruder stuck to his cheek like a bruise, while at school a polished coordinator in a tight gray vest smirked behind a counter of clean plastic, tapping a pen like a gavel as parents in crisp coats paraded binders past him as if the hallway belonged only to their story. I could smell wet leaves and old toner, see the fluorescent shine on the tiled floor where my boy's reflection wavered, and hear the careless, clipped voice that told us to come back after the celebration. No time today, not for questions, not for hurt. His smile small and sharp as a paper cut. So I lifted my clear plastic folder with the dog-eared student handbook glowing yellow at the edges and led my grandson toward the building's bright throat. Because if they were going to measure us by procedure, then we would measure procedure by its promise, and what happened when the doors opened next would turn their tidy script inside out. Before we continue, please subscribe and check in below. Where are you tuning in? If this hits home, share it so fewer elders carry this weight. The front door shuddered against the frame, and my grandson stood there with his cheeks wet, backpack hanging by one strap, whispering that they called him an intruder for asking why some classes were hanging Columbus banners while others were planning an Indigenous Peoples Day circle. Cold air followed him into the house. It brought the smell of wet leaves, the faint sweetness of laundry soap from the dryer, and something metallic from the old screen door that always needs oil. I told him to breathe with me, slow and even, the way his grandmother used to count before a storm rolled across the bay. He nodded, swallowed, and rubbed his palms on his jeans until the fabric turned darker where the tears had soaked in. I didn't say a single wise thing. I just crossed the hallway and lifted my simple plastic folder from the entry table, the one with the clear cover and the student handbook inside, dog-eared and marked with highlighter. The folder clicked when I tapped it straight on the wooden table. I slid in a blank sheet for an intake note, tucked a thin notepad behind the handbook, and added the old receipt from the last time I filed something with the office. It wasn't a weapon. It was a compass. The plastic smelled faintly like vinyl and dust, and the ink from my yellow pen. My hands moved from habit, slow and practical, while my chest felt crowded with heat. On the porch, the morning felt like a held breath. The neighborhood had already dressed itself for the parade. Small flags stapled to telephone poles, poster board signs taped to windows, folding chairs chained to metal fences so nobody would borrow a front row view. Down the block, a brass section was warming up, notes escaping in a tired, brave way. I unlocked the car and we settled in, my grandson quiet beside me, his phone in his lap, screen face down like it was ashamed. We drove past clusters of families in matching sweatshirts, past a boy practicing a baton toss in the street, past the grocery where someone had hung a red, white, and blue bunting crooked over the door. The heater breathed a thin cloud of warm air at my knees. The vents still rattled like they did last winter. When we pulled into the school lot, the asphalt was slick with last night's dew, dotted with chalk arrows telling the band where to line up later. I parked in a visitor spot and looked at my grandson. His hair was still flat on one side from where he'd rested his head on the bus window. I placed my hand on the folder and said we would go in step by step, the way you cross a creek on stones you can trust. The school's front door sighed when we pushed through. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with that thin mosquito whine that makes the back of your neck tense. The air smelled like disinfectant, paper, and a hint of overcooked tater tots from the cafeteria starting its day too early. On the right, the office window ran along the hallway like an aquarium, people behind glass, moving papers, passing a stapler, answering a phone with the shoulder pressed to the ear. An attendance board blinked with red dots. Farther back, a copier exhaled and flashed, and a roll of laminate film hung off its spindle like a shed skin.
The receptionist. She wore a lanyard crowded with little charms and a cardigan covered in tiny stitched apples, looked up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked if we had an appointment. Before I could answer, my grandson's breath hitched again, soft and quick. I told her we were here to file an intake request and open a student mediation. and then I set the folder on the counter so the handbook faced her, the page flagged where the school outlined the process for resolving conflicts with family participation. The plastic of the counter was cool under my knuckles. The handbook's edge left a pale line on the surface, as if the page drew itself straight. The receptionist's smile tightened. "There's a lot going on today," she said in a tone that sounded like a velvet rope. "It might be better to come back after the parade." She pointed toward a clipboard at the side, and the clipboard had a pen on a string, and the pen's cap had bite marks on it, an old story told by many anxious teeth. The hum of the lights thickened. I felt my grandson shift closer, the fabric of his jacket whispering against my sleeve. "No problem," I said, and kept my voice low enough to ground the room. I took the pen, wrote my name, and dated the line. Then I slid my intake sheet under the glass for the receptionist to copy, and I angled the handbook so the section heading could read itself to anyone willing to glance. Mediation procedure, timelines, right to involve a district supervisor, use of school spaces for restorative educational activities. The receptionist's fingers tapped on her keyboard, a fast staccato rhythm, and her eyes did that sideways calculation people do when they're looking for a place to set an obstacle. A man in a gray vest with a clipboard, academic coordinator according to his nameplate, came from the back office. He paused by the copier, then walked over to the window. His shoes made a neat sound on the tile, click, click, like a metronome. He glanced at the folder, then at my grandson, then back at the receptionist. He asked if we were connected to any group planning a demonstration. I told him we were here for a mediation intake under the family participation policy, and I lifted the corner of the handbook like a card at a fair game, letting the fluorescent light catch the highlighted lines. He suggested write a statement and leave it for review next week. I could feel the first barrier taking shape in the air like fog off a pond. Behind us, students drifted toward homeroom in small schools of chatter and shoe squeaks, the bell ringing with a flat tone that felt like a die landing on 6. My grandson set his phone screen up and opened his calendar. He had the school's public schedule pulled up already. He flicked to a list of room reservations and showed me 2 blocks that looked open later that morning. He didn't say anything. He just laid the phone next to my folder like we were building a bridge with quiet bricks. A paper trimmer chirped somewhere behind the counter. The receptionist asked for our student ID number and a brief description of the incident. I said my grandson had been called an intruder for asking a question about 2 different civic remembrances. I kept my words spare because extra words can trip you, and I let the silence breathe after them so they could settle. The coordinator asked which staff members were involved. I told him we were not accusing a staff member. We were asking the school to follow the handbook they gave us, to open a mediation that included family, and to allow a 2-part educational response that would not erase anyone. He asked what response I meant. I said on the intake form we would propose a listening circle with invited community knowledge keepers and a service day open to all. I could see his posture try to slide the conversation into later. He hinted at a special form. He mentioned a requirement for a curricular tie-in. He rubbed his thumb along the clip of his clipboard like he was polishing an idea he liked better. I made no move that could be mistaken for impatience. I simply turned the handbook toward him, pressed 1 fingertip above the line about timelines and external participants, and let my grandson draw a small breath that steadied the space around us. The office phone rang, shrill and insistent. The receptionist answered, typed, nodded to no one, and hung up. The copier warmed and purred, and the smell of toner swelled, a dry, chalky scent that clung to the back of my tongue. A stack of forms slid out and landed with tiny papery fuds. The coordinator asked the receptionist for a triage list, which sounded like the kind of order that creates order. He said there would be delays and perhaps a temporary hold on new issues until after the parade.
The fluorescent lights hummed a little louder, as if they were listening for a reason to flicker. I kept my palm on the folder, a gentle pressure on the plastic as if I were feeling for a heartbeat. The student handbook lifted slightly at the corner where the highlighter had thickened the page. My grandson reached into his backpack and took out a stubby pencil and the spiral notebook he uses for homework. He wrote the date and time in the top corner. He underlined it twice. Then he stood so his shoulder touched mine, no heavier than the touch of a breeze, and I could smell the worn cotton of his hoodie and the faint peppermint of the gum he likes to chew on the bus. The hallway outside gathered a new current of footsteps, adult footsteps, heavier and hurried. I turned my head and saw, through the glass, a cluster of parents pushing in from the front doors, arms loaded with binders and envelopes, faces set for a mission, and the coordinator lifted his clipboard like a flag and called for an immediate triage in the conference room. The current in the hallway carried us toward the conference room, but I held steady at the counter, like a post in a stream, hand still on my folder. The receptionist placed a new clipboard on the ledge, as if setting down a small wall. The form on top was not the intake I'd requested. It had blanks for clum activities and required a faculty sponsor. I read it twice, once with my eyes and once with the patience my late wife taught me in waiting rooms. I slid it back, warm from my fingertips, and asked for the mediation intake specified in the student handbook. My voice did not rise. It settled. The receptionist pursed her lips and reached for a drawer that groaned like an old hinge. She flipped through colored folders, found a stack of duplicates, and pulled a sheet that looked closer to what we needed. The page came with a faint toner band across the bottom, a gray weather front sweeping over the footer. I could see the lines for date, incident description, family contact, and a narrow box for requested action. I filled the first 3 carefully, printing each letter so even a stranger could read it. Then I paused with the pen above that small box and felt the years in my hand. I wrote, "Open student mediation per handbook policy. Schedule listening circle with invited community knowledge keepers. Schedule next day service event open to all. Request district supervisor presence. Request fee waivers and space use approval." The words looked too big for the box, but I made them fit, like we make whole lifetimes into small minutes. Behind the glass, the copier spat in word. The hum of the lights braided with the steady thud of footsteps in the hallway. A teacher with a key lanyard jingled past and left a faint smell of coffee. Somewhere, a radio crackled, and a voice mentioned the parade lineup. The receptionist asked for a student ID again, a second time, then asked for the spelling of our last name, even though she had it on the form in front of her. And then she asked if we had a second contact number, like more numbers could make it easier to hear what we were saying. Each small request was a pebble flicked at our knees. My grandson reached for his notebook and put our information down on the margin. He slid it toward the window, a quiet offer to save her time. She didn't look. She was already in a different drawer.
The academic coordinator returned with a triage roster, the cardstock thick and clean like something made for order. He raised his chin toward the hallway as if we should move with the new current. I said we would go when our intake was properly logged with a timestamp. His eyes did a quick calculation, half scheduling, half weather report. He asked the receptionist if she had stamped the sheet. She said she needed an initial from the assistant principal. He said the assistant principal was off campus, running parade logistics. A loop opened in the air. A hoop hung at shoulder height for us to jump through. I didn't jump. I placed the student handbook on the counter and turned to the page with the sentence about intake logs being stamped by the office, not by an administrator, on the day a concern is raised. I let my finger rest on the line just long enough for the lights to hum over it. My grandson stood closer now, close enough that I could hear the small change of his breath when he steadied it. He opened the calendar again and showed me a block of time where the multi-use room was not booked. He pinched and scrolled and found another opening in the afternoon. Then he drew a simple check mark on his own page and looked up at me, waiting for my nod. He didn't plead or posture. He held himself like a rope stretched just enough to be useful. The receptionist sighed and reached for a rubber date stamp. The ink pad made that soft kissing sound that always reminded me of library books. She pressed the stamp to the corner of our intake, left a red rectangle there with numbers that would anchor us in time, then pulled the sheet back to initial it in blue. She wrote the time, too, the minute precise as a tick. I felt a small relief thread itself through the tightness in my chest, not because something big had changed, but because one line was now real in the record and not just a promise floating in someone's mouth. The coordinator slid a second form across the counter. This one asked whether we intended to invite external participants, and if so, whether we accepted responsibility for their conduct and understood the district's facility rules. He tapped the space where a signature would go. The words were framed like a trap, but they were also an opening. I read the header, the subpoints, the light print at the bottom that referred to a facility use policy I'd seen years ago. I checked the box for invited community knowledge keepers and wrote as permitted by handbook mediation policy. Then I wrote request district supervisor oversight in the margin, small but legible. My grandson nudged the phone so the screen lit again, calendar squares glowing, a tiny constellation we could navigate by. A teacher came to the window and asked the receptionist for test forms. The receptionist handed her a stack, then turned back to us and said there might be fees for room setup or custodial overtime. I nodded and said we were requesting fee waivers due to the educational nature of the proposed activities, pointing to the line on our intake and to the footnote in the handbook that allowed for waivers in academic programming. She said those waivers would need principal approval. I said the district supervisor could validate waivers. She half shrugged, the kind of gesture that puts a hand into a pocket where nothing is kept. A group of students passed behind us, pushing a cart with folded chairs, and the cartwheel studded at a crack in the tile. Dust puffed up. I could taste it. The bell rang again, and the second hand on the wall clock jerked forward like it was yanked by string. A custodian rolled by with a yellow mop bucket and left a bright ribbon of floor that smelled of lemon and old raincoats. I remembered my wife's voice telling me to keep my feet where my purpose is, to move only when the ground is ready to catch me. I loosened my grip on the folder and drew a small square around the timestamp on our intake. It was still there. It would stay. The coordinator glanced toward the conference room door, then back at us, and said he would try to fit us into the triage. I said we would be ready when called. In the meantime, I asked for a copy of the stamped intake and a receipt of records submitted. He hesitated, then nodded. The copier light scanned over our page, a white line that passed like a careful comet. The machine fed out a warm sheet that smelled of plastic and heat. The receptionist clipped it to our folder with a silver bulldog clip whose teeth had been dulled by years of paper. I tucked the copy behind the handbook, all of it fitting with that stubborn kindness that paper allows. Then came a new barrier with a friendly voice. A volunteer in a school T-shirt approached and told us the conference room had limited seating and suggested that families without appointments might be asked to wait outside. She was gentle, and she smiled like someone stretching dough, but the words still drew a line at our feet. I thanked her and said our intake was stamped and we were ready when our names were called. My grandson leaned in and whispered, not with fear this time, but with a thread of purpose, that the multi-use room did indeed sit open later and that the student council had no reservation tag showing on the public calendar. I wrote those two facts on my notepad because facts have a way of surviving misunderstandings if you write them down. The receptionist returned with a pink slip acknowledging submitted attachments. She listed the items in quick shorthand: intake form, proposed activity plan, calendar printout, copy request for supervisor presence. She paused, pen hovering, then added my small map of the courtyard with suggested stations. The ink made a tiny scratch that sounded louder than it should have in my head. She initialed again, the blue line curling like a creek. When I looked up, the coordinator had stepped into the doorway of the conference room. Parents were filing in with their envelopes and binders, a procession of paperwork and worry. The door frame gathered them one by one, and their shoulders looked wide with purpose. The coordinator scanned the hallway and pointed at us with 2 fingers, palm facing down, the gesture you use when you want motion without noise. My grandson straightened, put his notebook back in his bag, and slid the phone into his pocket. I lifted the folder, felt its light weight and its heavy meaning, and checked that the handbook's flagged page still faced up. The fluorescent light steadied, humming like a low choir. The hallway cooled a degree, a trick of nerves, and the smell of toner gave way to a faint drift of cafeteria spices from the vents. I thought of my wife's handwriting in the margins of her recipe cards, how she always added notes about who would eat what, and I felt that same habit of care sit down in my bones. We walked the few steps toward the doorway. Each step counted in the small drum of our shoes on the tile, and when we reached the threshold, the coordinator raised a hand to stop us while he checked the list. Then the principal's office door opened, and the director herself fixed her eyes on us, tapped the back of a chair in the conference room, and said we would all be seated inside right now. The conference room air felt colder than the hallway, a manufactured chill rolling from the ceiling vent, thin as hospital breath. The door clicked behind us with a tidy sound that made the hairs on my arm lift. Long table, pale laminate scarred by years of elbows and coffee rings, chairs lined on both sides like teeth, a whiteboard on the far wall with a schedule drawn in squeaky marker. The fluorescent hum moved up a note as if the lights knew people were about to measure each other. I took the seat nearest the end, not at the head, not all the way back, a place where I could see the door and the window together. My grandson sat to my right, close enough that his sleeve brushed mine when he settled. The folder rested on the table, and I opened it with the same care I used to open my wife's recipe box. 2 fingers at the corners, one palm ready to steady what might slip. The student handbook lay on top, flags peeking like tongues of sun, and beneath it our stamped intake, still warm in my memory, the red rectangle of time firm on the corner.
The principal took the center chair, spine straight as a yardstick. The academic coordinator hovered at her shoulder, clipboard tucked under his arm, pen aligned to the clip as if order could be kept with geometry. The guidance counselor slid in near the middle with a stack of attendance sheets and a spiral-bound book with a blue cover, the kind of book that holds minutes and signatures and the slow, quiet history of rooms like this. She met my eyes for half a second and gave the smallest nod, the human kind, not the institutional kind, and my breath loosened by an inch. Parents filed along the opposite side, shuffling papers, clearing throats that didn't need clearing. I could smell 3 kinds of coffee, 2 varieties of cologne, and the sharp ghost of a dry cleaning bag. Someone's binder clip snapped open and shut, a nervous metronome. The principal asked for names for the record, tone level, eyes moving like a scanner over each face. The counselor sent the sign-in sheets down the line, and the pages whispered against the table as pens moved. My grandson leaned forward without being asked and printed his name in steady letters, then tilted the paper so the next person could reach. His hands did not shake. I turned the handbook so its printed spine faced the principal and opened to the section that mattered, the one that speaks in small, firm words about mediation, family participation, and the right to request district oversight. The highlighter glow on those sentences felt like a night path in the woods. I slid the stamped intake next to it,
then laid out the one-page activity sketch. Listening circle today with invited community knowledge keepers. Service event tomorrow open to all. Both linked to standards and social learning outcomes. Because I have learned that the language of care must dress itself in their vocabulary to be allowed inside. The principal folded her hands. Her wedding ring flashed once, a quick bright coin. She said it was a busy day, that feelings were high, that safety and order came first. The words made a soft wall in the air, softer than it felt. I said we were not asking for chaos. We were asking for the school to use its own policy to address what had already happened and to give students a structured way to hear and to help. I placed one fingertip above the sentence about timeline. The table's laminate held a thin trace of lemon cleaner and pencil shavings, and I thought of my wife's tidy dress drawer, how she kept an extra eraser in case a child forgot one. The coordinator cleared his throat and mentioned room availability and staff coverage. He said the conference room was booked later for parade debrief. The guidance counselor moved the spiral-bound minutes book closer to the center, set a pen on top of it, and reached for the attendance list to confirm the proper title for this gathering. She whispered it to herself as she wrote, Preliminary Mediation Intake Conference. The words fit on the line if you wrote small. She wrote small. She always had good handwriting. My grandson placed his phone near my wrist and opened the public calendar again. His thumb moved the morning's blocks as if he were smoothing wrinkles from a sheet. He pulled up the multi-use room and rotated the screen so the principal could see the white space around the hours. He didn't push it at her. He placed it like a courtesy, the way you set a glass of water within reach. The principal glanced, quick and sideways, and then looked back at me. I kept my palm flat on the handbook, as if the page could absorb steadiness. A clock ticked somewhere invisible, not the wall clock we could see, another one, perhaps inside the principal's computer, a digital tick in a hidden corner. Noise from the hallway leaked under the door, a rush of sneakers, a locker slam, the distant call of a band director counting off. The air conditioner sighed and a thin ribbon of cold air flowed down the window pane, drawing a foggy finger along the edge. I watched it until it cleared, a small lesson about breath and impermanence and the persistence of fingerprints.
The counselor placed the blue book at the table's edge and opened to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote the time. She left 3 lines blank for a case number and looked at the principal, who nodded as if permission could move ink more easily. The coordinator laid a thin stack of forms near the middle. Acknowledgement of participation, consent to record minutes, facility use guidelines. Paper slid against paper with the tiny hiss of linen on stone. My grandson's knee bounced once, and then stilled when I touched it with 2 fingers. Then the door opened, and the district supervisor stepped in with a soft knock. He wore a plain tie and a jacket that didn't show off. He carried a clipboard that was noticeably empty except for a single sheet under the clip. He shook the principal's hand, then the coordinators, then the counselors. He nodded to the room, made eye contact, and sat 1 seat down from the principal, not at the head, not at the foot. He set his clipboard flat and clicked his pen once. The sound was small but decided. The room's spine shifted by a degree. I slid a new piece of paper from my folder, a simple map I'd sketched of the courtyard with 3 circles, 1 for the storytellers, 1 for a student's reflection area, 1 for a resource table where families could sign up for the service event. I placed it on the table with the calm of someone setting a bowl before a person they love. Then I took out the second page, the service plan, tasks, times, adult points of contact, trash bags, gloves, a donation bin list. The pages smelled faintly like my printer at home, a ghost of warm plastic and ink.
My stomach tightened, but not in fear, in readiness. This was real work, not a speech. The principal asked whether any external participants had been contacted. I said no names had been promised, only an invitation drafted pending the school's approval. The counselor drew a small star next to that line in the minutes, the kind of star that tells the future where to return and check. The supervisor looked at the handbook page, just long enough to read the highlighted lines, and then he looked at our stamped intake. His eyes did not slide around the room while he read. They stayed where the words were, which is rarer than it should be. Opposite us, a father cleared his throat with a sound that wanted attention, and got it. He asked who would set the narrative for the listening circle. He said a lot of people felt erased by the talk around this day. He asked if a student's question was being used to shift the purpose of a celebration. The words came out with the edge of a shovel. Another parent, a mother with a green binder, said her child felt scolded for being proud. She tapped the binder with 2 polished nails and asked whether the school had a neutral position on national history or if it was choosing sides by choosing who to invite. Humiliation can come like a tide or a drip. Today, it came like both. The insinuation that my grandson's question was a scheme left a cold sap in my chest. I kept my mouth closed long enough to taste the metallic tang of the air. Then I said the circle was not to pick sides, but to widen the room so both members could breathe without elbowing each other. I pointed to the handbook language that called for restorative educational responses. I asked for a fair read of that line out loud. The counselor read it in a voice people use at bedtime, steady and unhurried. My grandson's shoulders lowered a fraction. He folded his hands on the table and waited, eyes tracking the pen as the counselor wrote. The principal asked the supervisor to confirm whether district policy allowed such a circle with external knowledge keepers. He said the policy allowed for it under staff supervision and with clear learning objectives, and he tapped his pen once at the margin of our plan, where I had written those objectives in phrases short enough to pass through a bureaucratic sieve. The coordinator made a note on his clipboard and underlined something invisible to me. The parents' binders whispered as they shifted.
The door drifted a little under the air conditioner's push, then settled. The hallway softened. In that pocket of quiet, the space between us felt like a rope pulled in opposite directions, slack nowhere. The principal reached for the minutes book and moved it closer to the center of the table, as if inches could make something official. I felt my wife's absence like a seat left empty, and thought about how she would have placed a palm gently on the edge of the blue book to anchor it. I laid my hand on the handbook, the plastic edge pressed into my palm. My grandson lifted his phone again and opened a notes app, typing time marks and keywords, nothing commentary, just stones across a stream. He looked up at me once, not asking, just checking we were still on the same shore. Then, across from us, a couple pulled a thick brown envelope from their bag, slid it into the center of the table, and spilled out a heavy stack of printed demands calling for the parade to be reviewed and a new directive on all celebrations to be adopted immediately. If you're still with me, tap like, drop your opinion in the comments, and share. Your voice pulls more chairs to this table. The papers from the brown envelope fanned across the center of the table like a deck built to win by overwhelm. Bold headings demanded the parade be reviewed and a directive issued for how all celebrations should be handled from now on. The font was large where urgency wanted to be seen, small where the conditions hid. I watched the district supervisor slide the stack toward himself with 2 fingers, the same way you ease a hot pan off a burner. He read in measured silence, pen resting along the clip of his clipboard, not tapping, not rushing. The principal's shoulders lifted and lowered once, a quiet reset. Then she reached for the blue minutes book,
drew a line across the page, and wrote a new subheading to hold what had just appeared. The guidance counselor moved a fresh sheet to the top of her packet and readied a space for action items. On my side of the table, the student handbook stayed open, like a small window that kept letting in the same light. The accumulation of requests, revisions, and cautions from the envelope did not surprise me. Days like this pull paper like tides pull driftwood. My chest still held a tightness, but it was the tightness of attention, not helpless fear. I anchored myself with what did not wobble: the red time stamp on our intake, the sentence in the handbook about mediation including family participation and restorative responses, the map of the courtyard with 3 circles, the service plan in plain language that could be checked off with a pencil. My grandson steadied his breath beside me. He opened his notes again and added a short line: outside requests logged, minutes updated. He kept it factual, as if the facts themselves could grow roots. The supervisor began sorting the envelope's contents by type: policy proposals in one pile, immediate demands in another, general concerns in a third. He slid the pile of concerns toward the guidance counselor as material for context during any listening activity. He placed the policy proposals near the principal, a signal that they belonged to a longer road with the school board and calendar committees. The immediate demands, statements to be read, instructions to be issued before the parade, he set aside, close to him, a hand covering the top page as if it might try to get up and walk. He asked for the relevant lines in the handbook to be read into the minutes. The guidance counselor read, voice calm and even, and the words set into the blue book like small stones pressed into a wet path. The principal asked the coordinator to check room availability on his end. He flipped through a grid of boxes on a laminated schedule sheet and then glanced at my grandson's phone where the same boxes showed blank. The coordinator gave a slow nod that matched the rectangles. The principal turned the minutes book a few degrees toward the center and suggested a temporary committee to manage the logistics of the mediation activities: guidance counselor for process, a social studies teacher for a curricular link, one parent representative to ensure community questions were carried faithfully, and me as the family member initiating the intake, with my grandson present as the students whose experience started the concern. The supervisor agreed to serve as oversight, not as owner, his posture making the distinction without a speech.
Subplots that had hummed at the edges began to find their shelves. The talk about fees met the handbook's note on waivers for educational activities. The supervisor confirmed that facility use for the listening circle and the next day's service event could be approved internally with his signature, pending standard safety checks. The guidance counselor added a line on adult supervision ratios and a first aid point at the edge of the courtyard. The coordinator confirmed custodial support would be available within normal hours, and if extra time was needed, he would note it for a separate approval. But he did not try to hang the approval on that hook. The receptionist's earlier hesitation lost its edge once our stamped intake sat in the minutes as an anchor and not a scrap of paper in a stack. Even the parents' concerns from the envelope found a place, recorded as input to be referenced when shaping the reflection prompts, not as veto power over whether people could sit and speak to each other. I slid the small courtyard map into the center so the supervisor could mark safety points. He drew a tiny square for the resource table and penciled a check mark where custodial supplies would be staged. The principal asked the guidance counselor to schedule a radio unit for the staff posted at the courtyard gate. The counselor wrote it down with a neat box to tick later. My grandson scrolled to a contact list he had already assembled, the one with names of community knowledge keepers that a teacher had once mentioned in class. He did not send messages or make calls. He simply noted where a call might be welcomed once the school gave formal permission. He added the word pending next to each name, a reminder not to race ahead of the process we were asking others to respect. We still sat on the same side of the table as the discomfort, but the room no longer leaned away from us. The principal's ring flashed again when she reached for the minutes book. When she set her hand down this time, the ring was steady, not a bright dart. The supervisor initialed a line approving the use of the courtyard and the adjacent multi-use room within academic hours, noted that the circle would take place as an instructional activity under staff supervision, and wrote that the service event would be recorded as a community learning extension linked to civic standards. His pen made that particular scratch that means the page will remember. The coordinator spoke about the parade debrief scheduled for later in the afternoon and said it could move to a different room, freeing this conference space if a follow-up was needed. The guidance counselor suggested a brief pre-meeting for adults before any listening began, just to align on tone and timing, and she wrote the suggestion into action items with the smallest arrow I have ever seen. My grandson drew a dot in his notes at the same moment, the dots lining up like the first stars that appear before the sky has made up its mind. I thought of my late wife and the way she would have closed her eyes for 2 seconds to feel whether a room was ready to hold something fragile. I let my own eyes close and listened past the fluorescent hum, past the click of a pen and the slide of paper. Somewhere out in the hallway, laughter rose and fell, not cruel, not kind, just children moving through their day. The sound reached me like a weather report. There is still ordinary weather here. The parents who brought the envelope spoke again. Their words came softer this time, the edges filed by the minutes book's patient spine. They asked that their concerns not be lost in the swirl of scheduling. The guidance counselor held up the blue book so they could see the lines that carried their words forward, exactly as spoken, but now housed in a place that expects to be read again. The supervisors set their stack into the concerns pile and said it would accompany the minutes as context for the listening circle design. Their shoulders changed shape when he said accompany. He did not promise agreement or adoption. He promised carriage.
The principal summarized what had been placed into motion, the intake recorded and time-stamped, the mediation framed as a 2-part educational response, the courtyard and room reserved within the day's academic hours, oversight present from the district, a small committee named to handle logistics and safety notes, and the envelope's contents logged as context, not a ruling. She asked the guidance counselor to read the action items aloud, not as a verdict, but as a checklist to be met with hands. The list was short and human. Confirm room and courtyard with facilities. Notify staff posted to the courtyard gate. Prepare attendance sheets and a simple prompt card for listening. Prepare a table for resource information and sign-ups. Hold a 5-minute adult alignment before students arrive. Invite, once permission is formal, the community knowledge keepers to sit in the circle. Schedule a sign-off meeting after the service event to place outcomes in the minutes. My grandson added each item to his own list. He drew boxes and left them empty, not because he feared they would stay that way, but because empty boxes remind us that tasks are lighter when they are visible. He slid his phone toward me for a second so I could see the calendar blocks he had turned from white space into soft placeholders. They were not invitations, they were intentions waiting for breath. The principal turned to the receptionist, who had stepped in quietly during the last exchange, and asked her to print the draft minutes for signature once the counselor finished the action items. The receptionist nodded and left with a purposeful step, The kind of step that means a printer will soon make its warm noise, and a piece of paper will come out that did not exist 10 minutes earlier. I felt in my fingers the familiar memory of warm toner and the way a page curls a little until the room cools it flat. We did not shake hands or declare victory. We closed folders. We capped pens. The supervisor drew his fingers along the top edge of the blue book as if smoothing a wrinkle no one else could see. And then he stood. The principal placed the pen on the minutes book and left it there, the way you leave a light on for someone you expect to return. The guidance counselor stacked her sheets in reverse order, so the first page would be on top when the printer did its part. The parents gathered their envelope and tucked it under an arm, paper now a little less heavy, not because the demands had changed, but because the room knew where to put them. I slid the map back into my folder and felt its plastic cover give that soft sigh it always gives. The highlighter on the handbook had not faded. The red time box on our intake had not smudged. My grandson stood at the same time I did, his notebook already back in his bag, phone dark again to save its battery for later. The air conditioner blew a final ribbon of cool along the window and then settled. When we stepped into the hallway, the smell of floor cleaner had thinned to almost nothing, and somewhere down the corridor a second bell sounded, not for us, but close enough to mark the hour we had made into a hinge. The courtyard at midday sounded like a breathing thing. Chairs scraped across concrete, the low hum of families collecting themselves into a circle, the rustle of jackets as a breeze crossed the flagpoles and sent the small pennants clicking against metal. The guidance counselor stood at a narrow table with attendance sheets and a stack of prompt cards, and the district supervisor checked a small radio and nodded to the staff posted to the gate. My grandson and I carried our folder to the resource table and set it down, the plastic warm from the sun. The student handbook lay open to the same page that held us steady inside, the highlighter a bright stripe in daylight. We had 5 minutes of quiet before the listening began. In that pocket, I breathed the smell of wet soil from the flower beds, a ribbon of cafeteria spice drifting through the open door, and the paper dry scent of the minutes book as the guidance counselor placed it on a clipboard. The principal came out from the building with a short stack of forms and stood where everyone could see her. She did not use a microphone. She used a school voice, the one that carries because it trusts people to listen. She said our gathering would follow the policy for restorative educational responses, that the minutes would record what the room decided, and that the district supervisor would witness the process. She did not add flourishes. She added time and place and purpose, and then she stepped back. The circle filled without a script. Students with backpacks still on, parents with elbows full of papers that had not found a home yet, teachers with lanyards that clicked when they moved. An elder from a local community took a seat that had been kept empty at the circle's heart. He carried nothing in his hands, only a calm that settled the air around him by a degree. A second chair remained open at his side for whoever needed to sit close and steady themselves. My grandson's breath had that small catch at the start and then went smooth. He sat on my right, pencil ready, not to tally, but to anchor. The guidance counselor invited us to begin with the simplest rule. Speak from your own experience, build on what you hear, and make room for the next voice. She placed the prompt card on the lap of the student closest to her. It asked what they had seen and felt that morning when the word intruder traveled a hallway like a cold draft. The student spoke softly about how a question had turned into a corridor's worth of eyes, some wary, some confused, how the word had been said as if doors had locks his face could not open. He did not accuse, he described. The elder folded his hands and listened the way some people hold a sleeping child,
steady and without interruption. The card moved. A mother spoke about her own father who waved a small flag until his arm hurt every year, and how she feared that part of him would be erased by any change. The elder nodded, as if to say, memory is not a pie with a fixed number of slices. The district supervisor stood under the edge of the roof where shade began, his clipboard resting at his side, eyes more on the people than on the paper. The principal didn't sit. She stood at the rear of the circle, not higher, not hidden. And when the card reached the couple who had carried the brown envelope, they held it as if pages could breathe through cardboard. They spoke about pride and continuity and the past taught one way. They worried the listening would become an instruction to be ashamed. The wind turned a sheet of their notes back on itself, and I watched the man smooth it down, the sound like a soft saw. When the card came to me, I did not speak about policy. I spoke about my grandson's face at our doorway and how the word intruder hung between us like a wrong key. I said I believed a school could be a place where two memories sit without knocking the other to the floor, if we use our rules to make more room, not less. And then I placed the card on my grandson's knee. He spoke with the kind of plainness that never finds a megaphone. He said he had asked a question because the hallway showed two stories, and he wanted to understand how they fit, and that the word thrown back at him had made his chest feel like the school didn't know where to put him. He did not perform pain. He named it, and then moved the card to the elder. The elder told a story that did not ask for permission to exist. He spoke of land and names and how every town sits on layers like a cake, each layer sweet to someone and bitter to someone else. He said ceremonies were not replacements. They were rooms you open so an old smell can come out and remind you that houses remember. He asked the students to imagine a circle so wide that it has to be walked with help. When he finished, the courtyard was quieter than when he had begun. Even the flagpoles kept still.
The guidance counselor moved to the minutes book and began to outline what the room had agreed a listening circle would do right now. Allow voices from multiple memories to be heard. Connect those memories to learning objectives already living in the social studies curriculum. And record any proposals for practical contribution to be addressed the next day. She wrote actions in verbs: prepare chairs, open door, invite, listen, record, confirm safety, sign. The principal stepped forward and did something I have rarely seen done well. She apologized in public for delays and mixed signals at the office that morning. She said the school had put weight on the wrong parts and that training would be scheduled for office staff and coordinators on intake procedures during high-tension days. She spoke without scraping blame off on anyone lower. The receptionist stood by the door, eyes bright, and nodded once. The academic coordinator, who had organized the clipboards and the lamination and the triage, wrote something on his own page that looked like a reminder for himself more than a report for anyone above him. The district supervisor asked to read the relevant lines from the handbook out loud. He read the clause about mediation with family participation, the allowance for community knowledge keepers, the option to request fee waivers for educational activities, and the requirement to log response within the day when a concern is raised. He read slowly and placed the page back on the resource table like a tool used and cleaned. He then wrote a short directive on his clipboard, authorizing the circle as an instructional activity and the service event as an approved extension with no facility charges. The consequences took the form they should take in a school: training dates on a calendar, an apology on record, and procedures adjusted to keep doors from narrowing next time. We moved from the listening to simple sign-ups at the resource table for the next day's service event. Tasks were listed in ordinary words: sweep, bag, organize donations, assemble kits, label, haul. The couple with the brown envelope approached and asked how concerns from their pages would be reflected. The guidance counselor lifted the minutes book and showed them the section marked Context for Prompts and suggested they add a note under their names for any specific prompt they believed should be included. They wrote in the margin the one request that mattered to them most. Do not erase pride. Ask how pride can be practiced without stepping on the dignity of others. It was messy handwriting. It was the kind that changes policy one margin at a time. The service event began under a thin sun. Students hauled boxes with that mix of sighing and joking that belongs to teenagers in groups. Parents worked in pairs who would not have spoken to each other in the morning. The custodian rolled out a cart with gloves and trash bags and gave a short safety talk about lifting with your legs and keeping your shoes tied. The principal carried a stack of blank name tags and asked people to write first names only, no titles, as if we were neighbors borrowing tools. The receptionist handed out markers and made a joke about her supply drawer always being in the wrong place. And in that joke, I heard the light scrape of a new habit forming. At the end of the service blocks, we gathered again where the chairs had been, the minutes book now thicker by a few pages. The district supervisor read the actions completed and the ones still to be checked. And then he asked if any person who had felt unseen in the morning felt less unseen now. Hands rose in different places. Not all. Enough. He signed the bottom of the page that sets timelines for staff training, and the principal signed the line committing to a dual remembrance approach for future calendar days, listening paired with contribution, both recorded, neither used as a cudgel against the other. The academic coordinator signed a note about intake procedures to prevent the kind of circular delay that had met us at the counter. No one clapped. People exhaled, like a shed muscle letting go.
My grandson stood with me by the resource table as the counselor tore the yellow copy from the minute set and placed it in our folder. The plastic sighed again when I closed it. The highlighter marks had held through sun and hands and air. The red timestamp on our original intake glowed like a coal under ash. I felt the tightness in my chest begin to lift in a way that did not erase the morning, but set it down where it belonged. The elder reached us and placed his palm over the folder without pressing, the way you touch a drum before you play it. He said nothing. He nodded once and stepped back into the flow of people leaving the courtyard. The principal approached with the receptionist and the academic coordinator and said they would issue a public note at the end of the day describing the mediation and the actions taken. She added that office staff and coordinators would complete a targeted training on intake and restorative responses within 2 weeks. She made it plain and left it standing. There was no speech about unity. There was a calendar and a signature. The couple with the envelope came by and did not offer concessions or victory. They offered a sentence that belonged in the margins, and it was accepted there. A consequence had taken shape, human and durable. When the courtyard began to empty, the wind moved one of the small flags so it tapped against metal again, regular as a metronome finding its tempo. My grandson slid his small pencil into his pocket and looked up at me with a face no longer pulled tight. He asked if he could keep the map we had drawn. I said yes and folded it once so it fit his notebook. The district supervisor gave a final nod and left through the gate. The guidance counselor closed the minutes book and rested both hands on the cover like a lid on warm bread. The principal stood at the doorway and let people pass first. I picked up the folder and felt it light in my hands, not because the papers weighed less, but because their weight had purpose now. We walked to the car without hurry. The sun made the asphalt shine, and a last chord from the band drifted from a far corner of campus, brave and slightly out of tune. My grandson reached for the handle and then paused,
watching the courtyard a second longer, as if making a small promise to a place that finally knew how to hold him. When memory and rule meet in good faith, a door that once pinched can open wide enough for all of us to walk through together. Respect, union, and contribution are the only flags that never need lowering. If this meant something to you, like and subscribe, and in the comments, tell me your choice in a moment like this. See you soon.